Hello and welcome to the latest podcast from the Centre for European Reform. I'm Ian Bond, the CER's Deputy Director, and I'm also the author of a new CER policy brief supported by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung UK and Ireland entitled EU-UK Relations. Will 2026 be the year to reset the reset? So the policy brief was intended as an overview of the status of the EU-UK relationship in a wide range of areas, with some thoughts on what should be done to give more momentum to the development of the partnership. And it's available on the CER website, cer.eu. And today I'm going to discuss how things stand in the relationship and what the prospects for the future are with Jannike Wachowiak, a researcher at the UK in a Changing Europe, and with Anton Spisak, as of this week, a senior research fellow at the CER. So it's very brave of him to come on the podcast straight away. Anyway, welcome to you both.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
So just a reminder, the Labour government came into office in 2024 with a manifesto that promised to reset the relationship with the EU. And the EU-UK summit last May, which was the first since Brexit, agreed on two important documents, a common understanding which set out a number of areas for possible future cooperation, mostly to do with economics and trade and the like, and a security and defence partnership. And that filled in a gap where the previous British government had decided to exclude these areas from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So perhaps I'll start with you, Jannike, and ask you, what impact is the security situation in Europe having on the EU-UK reset? How much difference have the situation in Ukraine and the presidency of Donald Trump and his attitude to Europeans made to the EU-UK relationship?
Thank you, Ian. I mean, if we look at what has happened in EU-UK relations since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we can certainly see that the war has been a catalyst for warmer EU-UK relations, particularly in terms of cooperation on sanctions and military training for Ukrainian troops and so on. And that was under the previous Conservative government. So we can say that between 2022 and 2024, the situation in Ukraine brought the two sides closer together, even though cooperation remained informal and ad hoc. Then Labour came into power in July 2024, and for the first time in a long time, there was a willingness to institutionalize relations to some degree. And this, as we know, led to the signing of the Security and Defence Partnership at the summit last year. The fact that they were able to agree this in time for the summit, I think, was in no small part driven by Donald Trump's inauguration only 4 months earlier, and kind of a real sense of urgency and momentum for closer EU-UK security ties. However, since the summit, the world has become an even more dangerous place, but paradoxically, this has not led to the EU and the UK taking their security relationship to the next level. I don't detect any particular urgency when it comes to implementing the security and defence partnership. Some new dialogues have been set up, but by far not all of them. And we haven't really seen any progress in terms of plugging the UK into the EU's CSDP missions or the European Defence Agency. And of course, we have seen the collapse of the SAFE negotiations. So for me, there is a clear disconnect between the geopolitics on the one hand and what has happened in the relationship since the summit. And maybe just to make a final point, I think we probably need to remind ourselves that EU-UK relations is not the only game in town, and we are seeing a lot more bilateral and minilateral activity in response to what's happening with Ukraine, but also in terms of what Trump is doing. So we're seeing kind of a reinvigorated E3 with the German, French and British leaders, but also, of course, the French-British-led coalition of the willing. So the EU-UK relationship will always only be one element of kind of the wider picture of security relations and institutions. But I think it's certainly the one element where it feels like more could be done.
Well, I would agree with Now, you mentioned SAFE, the Security Action for Europe. Just a reminder, that's a program to give EU loans for countries to procure military equipment in common. And the UK was never going to be eligible for loans, but it was supposed to open the way through the Security and Defence Partnership for the UK to negotiate to give its defence companies access to this program to be able to provide components, up to half of the components in weapons or munitions that were being paid for by the loans. So this was a program which the UK actually bigged up in some of its presentation around the time of the summit. I think Keir Starmer and others stressed that this might bring great employment benefits in the defence industrial sector in the UK and so on. So Jannike, what did go wrong, and how important was this failure, both in a practical sense? I mean, how much difference does it make to European defence whether or not the British are involved in this? But also, psychologically, does this feel like the EU telling the British, you have not been forgiven for Brexit, you haven't been forgiven for turning your back on us in 2016?
So I would say the negotiations collapsed due to a mix of lingering trust issues, vested interest in some member states, and political failure. And I think first and foremost, it was political failure because clearly the UK government had a keen interest in participating, and most EU member states wanted to see the UK involved as well. So what went wrong? I think in terms of the EU side, this clearly hadn't been pre-cooked enough. You will remember that at the EU-UK summit in May, Ursula von der Leyen stood in front of the press and said she thought it would be a matter of only a few weeks to get an agreement on SAFE. But in the end, it wasn't a matter of weeks. And instead, official EU-UK negotiations couldn't even start until 4 months later because EU member states were unable to agree among themselves on the participation criteria for third countries. And I think it was in those internal discussions where France in particular managed to persuade the others to set conditions, and particularly the infamous 6.5 billion entry fee that would be very hard to accept for the United Kingdom. And even though we know that other member states like Germany were worried about pushing the UK away with those conditions, they clearly did too little or were unable to push back against the French position. So I think in the end, the EU and the UK starting positions were just too far apart, and there wasn't enough time to bridge the gap before the 30th of November deadline, which was when EU member states had to submit their official request for loans. I think to me, what's most surprising is that there was no high-level political intervention when it became clear that talks weren't going anywhere. And I'm mentioning this because Keir Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen actually met on the sidelines of the G20 summit just days before the talks collapsed. But clearly they failed to give instructions to their officials to get this done, which I find quite surprising. In terms of the impact of it all, I think in practical terms, it's of course not ideal, but we have to remember that the UK is not completely shut out. So even without an agreement, 35% of the value of a contract could come from the UK. But psychologically, I do think the failure is a problem. I mean, first of all, this sends completely the wrong signal to Russia. And secondly, I think it might impact how both sides approach this going forward. I mean, we are currently seeing quite a lot of media coverage about the UK possibly joining a future round of SAFE. I would take this with a pinch of salt for now. First of all, we don't know whether there will be a second round. And second of all, I think we shouldn't underestimate that the UK side actually feels quite burned by the experience of the negotiation, and that member states are also keenly aware that the optics of the failure was quite bad. So I think before making a second attempt, both sides will want to feel confident that a deal can be done, which might be a bit of an obstacle in terms of getting started.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Anton, I'll turn to you and talk a bit about the common understanding, because the common understanding is mostly about economic issues, people-to-people contacts like the youth experience scheme, trade in food and agricultural goods, and so on. Now, the Labour manifesto from 2024, on which they fought and won the election, had a number of sort of pledges about how they were going to improve the relationship with the EU in concrete terms. And as a reminder, they were to negotiate a veterinary agreement to help UK creative artists to tour in Europe and to get an agreement on mutual recognition of professional qualifications. So, how much progress has been made on these issues? And is the EU trying to extract a high price for doing things that the UK would like to see happen? And looking at these pledges, they seem to me quite an odd collection. How much difference will UK voters feel, even if there is an agreement between the EU and the UK on these issues?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned those three pledges because if anyone's listening to those, they are very, very specific. It is about a veterinary agreement that would potentially reduce some of the barriers to trade when moving goods, agri-food goods between the UK and the EU. It is about touring artists that travel to Europe. It is about mutual recognition of professional qualifications. But I very much doubt that many of the voters that voted in the 2024 elections ever heard about mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and yet that thing actually ended up in the manifesto. And I think it's actually worth reflecting why that is the case. It is the case because those three pledges were very much a function of Labour's own red lines. And those red lines were no re-entering the EU single market, no customs union, and no free movement of people. So once you set those constraints, the menu of things you can actually do in practice on the economic side of the relationship is actually a little bit constrained. And that's why Labour put together that list of three very concrete ideas. In the end, what we got from the common understanding, which is the sort of document that was agreed last May between Prime Minister Starmer and President of the Commission von der Leyen, was a sort of a roadmap of a couple of things that would be agreed in the coming months and years. And there were three meaningful proposals that were agreed. One was an SPS agreement, which is the sort of veterinary agreement that Labour Party proposed. The second one was a linkage of emission trading schemes. It sounds very niche and technical, but it's actually really important for energy prices. And the third one is the UK rejoining the single electricity market. Again, very technical for most listeners, but actually really important when it comes to just making sure that electricity trading is done properly and that electricity grids in the future, especially in the North Sea, are interconnected. And there's actually been a good amount of progress on technical aspects of those files since last May. Those negotiations started, and there is now a real kind of negotiating momentum to try to get these issues agreed, at least in principle, before the time of the next summit, which will probably happen at some point this year, even though we don't really have a date yet. But the real question is, are these economic issues going to make a difference to the Prime Minister's objective, which is to get growth going in the UK economy? And that is really the key question here in many ways, because, Prime Minister's agenda and Labour's agenda right now very much rests on the question of can we make British people feel like they are going to be better off at the time of the next election? And growth is in many ways a big part of the answer that they're trying to suggest is going to actually make a difference. Now, I don't think any of these things will actually make a noticeable difference to growth. They're all really important economic issues that need to be addressed in the relationship between the UK and the EU, but the amount of difference that they will make in the aggregate before the time of the next election is going to be negligible. And I don't think very many voters will notice that difference of any of these files that are very well intended, but will not achieve, I think, what the Prime Minister was hoping it would achieve, and that is to really demonstrate that the Labour Party has got a good agenda on growth and that Europe is part of that agenda.
Yeah, so you mentioned the three red lines. I mean, the puzzle for me is why did Labour choose to set down those red lines, which clearly were going to limit what they could do? I don't know whether you have any thoughts on, why did they choose to do that, but perhaps looking forward, the international trading system is under considerable pressure as a result of Trump's tariffs policy and the gigantic overcapacity and dumping on international markets of goods from China. So even if these red lines were a good thing when they were put into the manifesto, which, one might question, should the UK be revisiting them? And if it should, in what way would you, if you were advising Keir Starmer, what would you advise him to do with his red lines?
Well, I think, on your first part, Ian, about why these red lines were put in the manifesto, I think, they're primarily about political risk management. They're really designed to take the fundamental question of Europe off the table in British politics because there was a sense that the British public was tired of the debate on Europe that has been taking place over the last decade or so since the referendum and even before then. So in that sense, I think it was understandable why Labour Party's strategy was just to put that question aside. That was really a defensive strategy. It wasn't one that was really in any ways going to make a fundamental difference to the post-Brexit relationship between Britain and the EU. Now, I think, as you rightly said, Ian, and as Jannike explained to us, the world has changed since 2021 when the TCA was agreed, and even most, in many ways, even since the 2024 election. And a big part of that is, of course, the fact that we now have a US president that is willing to openly attack America's closest allies and even threaten economic retaliation against them if they don't align with the alleged US interest in many cases. And on the other hand, we have a very assertive China that is dominating the global economy in very unpredictable and novel ways that is affecting everybody in the global system through all kinds of effects on global prices, on competitiveness, on economic security, access to critical minerals, and you can name all the other issues. And those are the challenges that both the UK and the EU face together. There's absolutely no difference in the fundamental here, which is the fact that both the EU and the UK are on the same side of the equation. And yet, at the moment, if you look at the day-to-day functioning of the EU-UK relationship, there's a real gap between those kind of geopolitical strategic questions and the sort of technical details, I would say, that we've been talking about SPS agreement and linkage of emission trading systems and all of these questions, which are really important in themselves, but they will really not change the sort of positioning of a united Europe against a common set of threats from the outside. And I do think that is not only a function of the British politics in this case and of the British government, but it's also a function of the European side. I think there is no question that there ought to be a reflection in Downing Street about whether these red lines serve the purpose and in what ways they need to be a little bit tweaked. You don't necessarily have to change them, but you do need to show a little bit of flexibility within those red lines. But there is also a question on the European side, and that is a really big question about how do they engage with third countries that are close allies and partners in a more strategic ways, so that issues like the safe fiasco that we saw back in the autumn don't come back again on the table, because those are exactly the types of little actions that signal to our adversaries and the world that Europe is not united. And I think that's where the real problem lies.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good segue to the question of what happens next. And Jannike, I'm going to turn finally to you on this. Obviously, in both the Common Understanding and the Security and Defence Partnership, there's a lot that was agreed at last year's summit that has yet to be implemented, because a lot of what was agreed last year was we will explore, we will discuss, we will have a dialogue on. But we're already starting to think about the next summit. And although we don't know exactly when it is, there seems to be a lot of talk that it might be after the UK's local elections, which take place in early May. So that's not very far away. And in addition to the summit, we also have the Trade and Cooperation Agreement implementation review, which is also supposed to start in May. So I guess the first question is, how important are these events going to be for the development of the EU-UK relationship? Are they just going to be kind of tick box bureaucratic exercises in which everybody meets and says everything is going splendidly, we're going to carry on implementing what we've agreed? Or, is it going to be something more fundamental? I mean, I think you and Joël Roland a couple of years ago in a paper for the UK in a Changing Europe set out some of the different ways in which the two sides could handle the TCA implementation review. And I wonder whether you have any sense of how they are now approaching this and whether they're looking to do something more radical than, saying paragraph 3 didn't work and we should change A to thee or thee to A. Are we going to get something more significant this time around?
Thanks, Ian. That's a nice blast from the past there for me. We published that report in September 2023, and around that time, Keir Starmer and David Lammy started talking up the TCA review as an opportunity to improve the UK's trade deal with the EU. And I think for Labour, back then in opposition, this was mainly about political signalling to show to the electorate and Labour members that in government, they would take a different approach vis-à-vis the EU. At the time, they were suggesting to use the review to do things like join the Horizon Research Programme, negotiate a security pact, a veterinary agreement. So many things that were then later to form part of their manifesto. The EU's response at the time was that they see the review very much as a technical exercise, which is about reviewing the implementation of the TCA and not the TCA itself. My overall assessment would be that the EU's position on this still holds. I don't think the review will be a big moment for 3 reasons. First of all, in many ways, the review has been overtaken by the common understanding that was agreed at the summit in May last year. And Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Europe Minister, acknowledged this himself. Second of all, the Partnership Council, which is the main EU-UK forum under the TCA, met in February, so just a few days ago. And the joint statement that was published afterwards hints at the TCA review, but in the context of the ongoing role that the specialized committees and the domestic advisory groups play in addressing implementation issues. So to me, this sounds very much like the intention to keep this at the technical level. Lastly, I think the EU has no reason to make the review a big thing. I mean, they think the TCA works fairly well. They've said this in their kind of implementation reports, which they do once a year. And also they simply have other pressing priorities. And I think reviewing, let alone renegotiating the TCA is not top of the EU's list. So my overall prediction or sense would be that the annual summit, rather than the review, will be kind of the set piece where you can continue to build on the TCA, because the summit is more of a political moment. But even then, I believe that any progress will be incremental and that the TCA will remain the basis of the relationship in coming years, particularly when it comes to trade. Security and defense, I would probably put in a slightly different category, which is likely going to be driven more by external events. But yeah, I think if we're talking about what's next for EU-UK relations, I think the summit is going to be more interesting than the review. And the summit is probably going to fulfill the function of accelerating the delivery of the common understanding, to manage some existing political issues around kind of expiring chapters in the TCA and stuff like that. And then lastly, to raise the level of ambition if that's politically desired from both sides.
Well, I must say, from my perspective, we definitely need a higher level of ambition just to reflect what's been going on in the world around us. Anyway, I think that's all we've got time for, but I'm very grateful to my guests today, Jannike Wachowiak and Anton Spisak. Thanks very much for listening to this podcast from the Centre for European Reform. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to the series on your preferred podcast platform, and please leave us a good review. Thank you very much, and goodbye.